Sorry.
That's okay. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Thank you. Perfect. Perfect. Do you have any more?
We are fully out. He found one that was hidden away. Sorry.
I just saw it in the corner there. I thought I was being so damn clever. You should have looked around the corner.
I'm going to have to go downstairs in a little while. So you'll have to see. Okay, I'm warming it up for you.
There we go. Problem solving.
Oh, you look very tall and stately.
Exactly.
And I told her, no, I'm not moving. And I said, and she said, I said, I like you as a professional, but I said, I'm not moving. Because I said, well, some people the book. She said, I can't. I told her,
So what are you sitting on?
I don't know what
Is it that?
it's a very special
It's a special one to reach out all these people.
Yeah, the librarian.
Yes, exactly. I have one, but it's much smaller than I have it outside.
So you
I know
No, I'm Mr. Rossi. We can always throw the rascals out.
Well, yeah, but they keep sneaking back in. Yeah, and they can throw the back door. Will not die. Exactly.
Hello, and welcome to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Nicole Davidow, and I'm an event staffer here at the store, where we are clearly back to hosting in-person events. We're also doing virtual ones, partnered support events, trips, classes. Everything wonderful can be found on our website at politics-prose.com. So before we get started today, a little bit of the housekeeping. If folks wouldn't mind checking that their phones are silenced, beeper silenced, anything that will make noise silenced. Masks are optional. I know we are in sort of close proximity. So if you wouldn't mind, if you want to grab one, they're at the front of the store. We are audio recording, so once the Q&A portion of the talk begins, we do ask that you line up over here by this white pillar to ask your questions to make sure we capture it. After the Q&A, we'll do a signing line. Once again, we'll start the line at that pillar, and we will have the author right here to sign everything for us. And books can be purchased behind the counter. After the event, and I'll remind you of all this later, don't worry. You'll just fold up your chairs, put them against anything sturdy. That would really help us out. So without further ado, tonight I'm super excited to welcome Lynne Olson in celebration of her book, Empress of the Nile, the daredevil archaeologist who saved Egypt's ancient temples from destruction. In the 1960s, the world's attention was focused on a nail-biting race against time. 50 countries contributed nearly $1 billion to save a dozen ancient Egyptian temples built during the height of the pharaohs' rule from drowning in the floodwaters of the gigantic new Aswan High Dam. But the massive press coverage of this unprecedented rescue effort completely overlooked the French archaeologist who made it all happen. Without the intervention of Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt, the temples, including the Metropolitan Museum's Temple of Dendur, would be at the bottom of a huge reservoir. In this incredible book, Olson discusses how de Roche-Noblecourt, among other iconic women, helped preserve a crucial part of Egypt's cultural heritage and, just as important, made sure it remained in its homeland. Olson is the New York Times bestselling author of Madame Fourcade's Secret War, Last Hope Island, Those Angry Days, and Citizens of London. She has been a consulting historian for the National World War II Museum in New Orleans and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum here in Washington, D.C. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Lynne Olson.
Thank you, Nicole. And thank you all for coming out on this cold night. Oh, my God. I am always thrilled to come to Politics and Prose when I write a book because it's really, it's my happy place. I mean, we lived 6 blocks away from Politics and Prose for, I don't know how many years, Carly, how many years? A lot of years. Our daughter was 3 years old when we moved in. She became a total devotee of Politics and Prose right from the beginning. She just moved back to the hood a couple of years ago. She's living at Albemarle in Connecticut, and is she's a devotee of Politics and Prose. I mean, she spends half her disposable income in this store. and tonight, when I came in, 3 books she had just bought. So anyway, this really is, I feel I'm home when I'm here. Before I start, I would like to, I mean, there are a lot of people here that I know and love, but I would like to single out one person, and where are you, Dory? Could you stand? I'd like to introduce Dory Laurent, who is my partner in crime on this book and the book that I wrote before this, Madame Farcad's Secret War. Dory and I were colleagues in the research doing this. I could not have done this book without her. Very quickly, let me just tell you this very funny story about how I met Dory. I was starting work on Madame Farcad, which is about a French woman. It's about the French resistance. I don't speak French. So I put an thing in the listserv for Wesley Heights and said, please, I'm desperate to find somebody who can help me with this book. And I got about 8 responses. And the first one, immediately, it was like 5 minutes, I think, after I had put it in, was from Dory. And I didn't know her. But it turns out she lived in Paris for 25 years. She was a Time reporter in Paris for not for 25 years, but for a number of years. And she's my neighbor. She lives only about, 6 houses away. So we have been together for now, 5 years, something like that. And as I said, I could not have done this without her. So I'd like to start by taking you back to December 12th, 1940. That was 6 months after the Nazis invaded and occupied France. A train has just pulled into the station at Moulins, a town in the central part of the country. A few moments after it's come to a stop, a German in a black SS uniform storms into one of the train's compartments. He orders a young woman sitting there to show him her identity papers. She hands them over. They say she is Christiane de Roche, the acting curator of Egyptian antiquities at the Louvre Museum in Paris. The SS man stares at the card and then at her. "Get up," he shouts, grabbing her by the arm and hustling her off the train. It's a freezing cold day, and Christiane de Roche spends the next several hours shivering in a cell in the Gestapo headquarters at Moulins. Finally, she's escorted to a large room containing several Germans in SS uniforms. They're leaning back in their chairs, their boots on a desk, smoking cigars. One of them asks her in French if she speaks German. Although she does, she replies, "Not only do I not speak it, I don't understand a word of it." Later, she would say about her interrogation, "I was not willing to be amiable." The Germans begin throwing questions at her, to which she responds, "Why do you want to know this?" One of her interrogators snaps, "You weren't asked for your opinion," and she snaps back, "Tell me first why I'm here." He growls, "If you don't know, you'll find out soon enough." The men refuse to believe Christiane's claim of being an Egyptologist. To them, she is a spy for the Nazis, for the Allies. In reality, she is both. But she keeps pushing back against their allegations. As the interrogation continues, her temper grows shorter and shorter. She's already had plenty of experience dealing with arrogant men like these. In the macho, rough-and-tumble world of French archaeology, women are an extreme rarity, and she's been shunned and harassed since her earliest days in the field. 2 years before, she had been named the first female scholar at the French Institute of Oriental Archaeology in Cairo, which is France's elite research center for the study of ancient Egypt. When her appointment was announced, her male colleagues rose up in revolt, refusing, in her words, to share the library or even the dining room with me. They said I would collapse and die in the field. But neither that revolt nor the many, many other acts of discrimination she faced in her career were enough to stop Christiane from becoming one of the world's foremost experts on ancient Egypt. She is well along on that path at the time of her arrest by the Gestapo, and even at a moment when her life is clearly in danger, this young archaeologist, who stands just 5 feet tall, cannot abide the idea of men refusing to take her seriously. At one point, she scolds the Germans for their bad manners, saying, "I can't believe how poorly you were raised. Is this any way to receive a woman with your feet on the table?" For a moment, they were speechless, she later said, but I kept going. I couldn't stop cursing at them, and they ended up sending me back to my cell. Unbelievably, the next day they summoned me again to tell me that for the time being I was free, but that I would hear from them soon. As the Gestapo learned, Christiane de Roche refused to be intimidated by anyone. A real-life female version of Indiana Jones, she told an interviewer many years after World War II, "You don't get anywhere without a fight, you know. I never looked for the fight. If I became a brawler, it was out of necessity." Christiane's lifelong love affair with ancient Egypt began when she was a toddler, and her grandfather took her to see the obelisk of Luxor, the pink granite pillar that looms over the vast Place de la Concorde in Paris. The obelisk, her grandfather told her, was more than 3,000 years old, created during the reign of Ramses II, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. At that point, Christiane had no interest in the history of the obelisk, or for that matter, of ancient Egypt. What fascinated her were the mysterious hieroglyphs engraved on the obelisk's four sides. In 1922, when she was 9 years old, British archaeologist Howard Carter made one of the greatest archaeological finds of all time, the discovery of the unplundered tomb of the young Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. Like countless other people around the world, Christiane was mesmerized by news of the extraordinary treasures found in the tomb, including the solid gold coffin containing Tutankhamun's mummified body and the gold mask covering his face. "For me, it was like a fairy tale," she said. At that time, no one understood why this pharaoh was buried with all these beautiful objects. We were talking about the treasures without trying to go further, but I was asking myself a lot of questions, trying to figure out the reason for them. Christiane's determination to know more about the riches of Tutankhamun would lead to a lifetime of work to unlock the secrets of ancient Egypt. In the 1950s and 1960s, her passion for the country, both present and past, would result in an extraordinary crusade to save some of its most priceless antiquities. That crusade was initially ridiculed as quixotic and hopelessly delusional. But as it turned out, that effort would end up producing the greatest single example of international cultural cooperation the world has ever known. Through it all, Christiane behaved, as she demonstrated with the Gestapo, like a female action hero come to life. A woman who swaggered, a woman who talked and fought back, a woman who owned her power. Before I tell you more about this amazing woman, I'd like to talk a bit about how I decided to make her the centerpiece of this book. Empress of the Nile is a departure for me as a historian. I've written 8 books before Empress, and most of them have focused on some aspect of World War II. That's my specialty. This one, of course, is very different because it concentrates on archaeology and ancient Egypt. Actually, when I first started thinking about a topic for this book, my impulse was to find another subject dealing with the war, lazy that I am. So with that in mind, I began researching the first organized resistance network in Paris. It was the Musée de l'Homme Network, the Museum of Man Network. And it was named for its headquarters, which was the Museum of Man in Paris. It's France's leading anthropology museum. What interested me about this group was that most of its members were intellectuals and that women played very important roles in creating it. But as I learned more about it, I became particularly fascinated by the story of one of its women members, who was Christiane de Roche. One of the things that really interested me was the double life she led during the war, working at the Louvre during the week while risking her life in the resistance at night and on the weekends. As I found out more about her and what she had done, particularly after the war, I realized what a bold, trailblazing, history-making woman she had been. So I dropped my idea of writing about the network and decided to focus only on her, with the primary focus, her seemingly hopeless campaign in the 1960s to save several ancient temples in Egypt from being destroyed. Going into it, I have to confess I was a little hesitant. It meant I had to get out of my comfort zone, and I had to become steeped in a whole new subject that I knew virtually nothing about at that point. But as I got into it, I became really energized. I realized I had been coasting for a while. You know, when you specialize in one area, I mean, World War II is a huge area, but I mean, mine is it's Europe in World War II, and particularly 1940, 1941. So you know, it was fairly compact, and so I really had a storehouse of research. So I thought, you know, it'd be easy to do it, but then I realized that when I became really energized about doing a new subject, I realized I'd been coasting for a while. And it was really fun to find out about something and someone totally new. So back to Christiane. How did she go from World War II to becoming the spark plug of the greatest archaeological rescue in history? I want to lay a little groundwork first by giving you a little background of modern Egyptian history. Many, if not most of you, probably already know this, but just in case. In July 1952, Gamal Abdul Nasser, a colonel in the Egyptian army, led a military coup, overthrowing the Egyptian monarchy and declaring Egypt's independence from Britain, which had basically controlled the country for almost 100 years. A number of other countries had dominated Egypt before then. In fact, Nasser, if you can believe this, and I had a hard time believing it, was the first Egyptian to rule Egypt since Cleopatra, who died in 30 BC. That's 2,000 years. Britain, though, wasn't the only Western country with tremendous power in Egypt in the pre-Nasser days. France had considerable sway in cultural matters, particularly in archaeology. In fact, for more than a century, the French had dominated Egyptian archaeology, overseeing not only all excavations in the country, but the treasures that resulted from them. Nasser and the other leaders of the coup wanted all this stopped. They immediately dismissed all British and French officials who had worked in major Egyptian government agencies, including the French archaeologists who controlled the government's antiquities department. But there was one Western archaeologist they allowed back in, and that was Christiane de Roche, whose name now was Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt. She had married a man named René Noblecourt during the war, and she was now hyphenating the two names. She was invited back to help the Egyptians create an elite research center of their own for the study of ancient Egypt. News of her appointment landed like a bombshell in the male-dominated world of Egyptology. She was one of the first women of any nationality ever appointed to a leadership position in the field. But that was not why the shock was so intense. It had more to do with the fact that she intended to make Egypt a major player in Egyptology. For more than a century, Western Egyptologists had been telling Egyptians what to do, and now their supremacy was being undermined. Christiane's close relationships with the Egyptians with whom she had worked had long annoyed some of her male colleagues. Unlike most of them, she spoke Arabic and was known for her care of the laborers she oversaw on her various digs, treating them with dignity and getting to know them as individuals. But her colleagues' irritation exploded into outrage when word spread of her participation in the creation of the new research center. She remembered them telling her, "You can't possibly be serious about teaching them our methods. We will no longer be the masters of our excavation sites." There was also astonishment that officials in Egypt, a patriarchal, heavily Muslim country, would reach out to a woman for the post. At the time Christiane wrote, a woman seemed to have hardly any chance of success in Egypt. How would I get men to listen to me, many of whom were considerably older? Would they respect me? The answer, she said, was simple. I was able to do it because I treated these people with respect and friendship, and never allowed myself to speak to them in overly familiar terms, as many of my colleagues did. For me, it was unthinkable to consider the Egyptians as people unlike ourselves, simply because they were different and belonged to a country apparently less developed than ours. Although she didn't mention it, it was also true that as a woman, she had much in common with the Egyptians, having been condescended to and treated like an outsider by male Egyptologists. Soon after Christiane arrived in Cairo, President Nasser announced plans to build a massive new dam near the town of Aswan. The dam was meant to provide enough water and electricity for Egypt's rapidly exploding population. But its construction would come with a horrendous price. The floodwaters from the dam would swallow up more than 20 spectacular temples built thousands of years ago during the most glorious period of pharaonic history. They included the two massive temples of Abu Simbel, carved out of a solid rock cliff overlooking the Nile, under the orders of Ramses II, arguably Egypt's most powerful pharaoh. Christiane insisted that these temples must be rescued. What she proposed was a project of almost unthinkable magnitude and complexity. Along with enormous engineering challenges, there were also huge political problems involved in urging international cooperation during a dangerous escalation in tensions in the Middle East and elsewhere. The U.S. and British governments, which were violently anti-Egypt and violently anti-Nasser, not only refused to have anything to do with the project, but actively tried to prevent it. In Christiane's words, "I was repeatedly told, 'Why are you bothering with this? These are not your monuments.'" She refused to accept that argument. Along with the United Nations agency UNESCO and the Egyptian Minister of Culture, she embarked on a public relations blitz to inform the world about the threat to the temples, a campaign that produced a deluge of international media attention. In the words of one of Christiane's friends, she had a magnificent sense of media, of popularization. She knew how to bring Ramses II and the other pharaohs back to life as if she had just had a drink with them the night before. As it turned out, thanks in large part to her pugnaciousness and determination, more than 50 countries did in fact come together in the nick of time to save the temples. Dozens of countries formed national teams made up of researchers, archaeologists, historians, engineers, and architects to help in the rescue, which posed the biggest challenge in the history of archaeological engineering. One of the biggest challenges was how to save the Abu Simbel temples. Has anybody here seen Abu Simbel? A number of you. There are a lot of pictures in the book. They are just awesome. The temples themselves are awesome. But what are even more awesome are 4 70-foot-high statues of Ramses that act as guardians that are carved into the rock. Moving these monuments, which were made of sandstone as fragile as the finest crystal, at first seemed impossible. It was finally decided, after many months of agonizing, to cut them into large blocks and reassemble them like a vast Lego set. Over a period of 4 years, huge teams of workers sliced 1,042 blocks, most weighing more than 20 tons, and moved them to a new location 1,900 feet higher and 900 feet back from the riverbank, where they were put back together. I should add, not one stone was lost. While this was going on, Christiane discovered that the moving of one of the smaller temple complexes was proving even trickier than that of Abu Simbel. This smaller temple was covered with brightly colored wall paintings, which would have been destroyed by dismantling them block by block. But there was not enough money in the budget to pay the extraordinarily high costs of finding a way to preserve it. Without checking with the French government, Christiane pledged that France would provide not only the engineering expertise, but also the funds to do so. When she returned to Paris, she was summoned to the Élysée Palace to meet with a very angry French president, Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle, who was famous for his quick temper and caustic tongue, rose from his desk and at 6 feet 5 inches tall, towered over the 5-foot-tall Christiane. "How dare you engage France in this without the authorization of my government?" he yelled at her. Christiane paused for a moment before replying. She remembered how, on June 18, 1940, de Gaulle had broadcast to the French people from the BBC in London, urging them to resist the Germans and defy the collaborationist Vichy government of Marshal Philippe Pétain, which at the time was the legal government of France. Looking up at de Gaulle, she snapped back, "And you? Did you demand the authorization of Pétain's government on June 18th, 1940? No. You judged that the circumstances required you to take a stand. Well, that's what I've done." For a moment, de Gaulle stared at her, totally dumbfounded. Then he did something exceedingly rare for him. He laughed. "You win," he said. The money was approved, and the temple was rescued. The saving of the Egyptian temples, as I said earlier, turned out to be the most important archaeological rescue operation in history, and it was clearly a huge triumph for everyone concerned. For Christiane, it meant the preservation of a crucial part of its heritage. For Christiane, it was an astounding personal achievement. For Egypt, it meant the preservation of a crucial part of its heritage. It also paved the way for the protection of precious historical monuments on an international scale. I'm sure you've all heard of the World Heritage Project that was organized by UNESCO. UNESCO was heavily involved in the temple's rescue and capitalized on an idea first suggested by Christiane, who declared that certain monuments were too important to be considered the property of individual countries and should belong to humanity as a whole. 4 years after the Egyptian temples were saved, the United Nations introduced a convention protecting such sites. Today, 185 countries have ratified it, with 35 campaigns currently underway to save monuments considered endangered. The saving of the temples was also important for the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Without Christiane and her crusade, the Met would not have one of its most popular attractions, the Temple of Dendur. Dendur was among the monuments about to be destroyed by the construction of the Aswan Dam. Before I end, there's one final point I'd like to make. Christiane was not the only woman to make a crucial contribution to the rescue of these priceless antiquities. There was one other, and that was Jacqueline Kennedy, America's new First Lady. I had no idea of her involvement until I was well into my research. When I wrote my proposal for Random House, she never appeared on the radar. It was during my research that I found out that in the early 1960s, Jacqueline Kennedy was responsible for persuading her husband to reverse American opposition to help preserve the temples. Thanks to her influence, President Kennedy, just in the nick of time, called on Congress to authorize enough money to ensure the saving of Abu Simbel. Later in the 1960s, Egypt sent the Temple of Dendur to the United States as a thank you gift for the work of the Kennedys in persuading Congress to help fund the monument's preservation. There's a wonderful kicker to this story. Jackie Kennedy and Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt met each other for the first and only time in 1973. But neither of them apparently had any idea that the other woman had played a major role in the fight. Both of them had worked largely behind the scenes, and neither had received much, if any, public attention at that point for what they had done. Indeed, Jackie Kennedy had insisted that her activism not be publicized, and as a result, her role is still largely uncelebrated to this day. But even though she never talked about it in public, about what she had done, she took enormous pride in her accomplishment, telling her daughter Caroline that her successful efforts to help save the Egyptian temples meant as much to her as her celebrated restoration of the White House. Without these two women, Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt and Jacqueline Kennedy, this extraordinary rescue would never have happened. Abu Simbel, Dendur, and the other antiquities would today be at the bottom of an enormous reservoir, and the world would be, at least culturally, a much poorer place. It's time to give these two female action heroes the credit they deserve. Thank you. And now I will be more than happy to take questions. This is my favorite part of the whole evening.
We used to live in Egypt, and one of the questions raised by agronomists and others was simply that the Aswan Dam was a great big mistake. And the World Bank refused to fund it. They went to the Russians. They put the thing up. The Nile floods improperly. The matter that used to come down and fertilize the fields no longer happens. And the whole thing was and apparently remains a mess. And I don't know if that assessment is correct, but that's what we listen to all the time. And I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
From my research, you're right. I think, what I've read is that if he had done, 2 or 3 or 4 dams, if he had, instead of making this one massive dam, but it was really, I think, part of national pride, part of his pride, part of national pride, that they were going to build the biggest, the best. And it wasn't just the temples that were wiped out. Hundreds of other antiquities were, in fact, drowned. And, thousands and thousands of people in Nubia were displaced from their homes. They were forced out of, homes that they had had for centuries along the Nile and sent off to the desert in Egypt. I think overall it was pretty much of a disaster. It did provide energy for agriculture and electricity, but I think you're absolutely right. Everything that I've read suggests that you're absolutely right.
Because when we were there, they were replacing the electricity generating things on the dam. And that was a big mess because they had to go back to the Russians for them, and the Russians weren't. That's a different topic. I won't bore you with that.
Thank you. Anything else?
How did anyone that quickly find allies? Because she couldn't have done it just by herself.
No.
And she sounds as if she would have been impossible to work with.
A lot of people said that, Albert. No, it took years. I have telescoped this. I go into great detail about how long it took for her to persuade people. She finally got the Egyptians. It was just incredible. The Egyptians, when she said, "You've got to save them," and the Egyptians themselves said, "Well, we can't. The future is more important than the past." It's very lamentable that we're going to lose all these great treasures, but that's just the way it goes. And she refused to accept that, and she finally persuaded the Egyptian cultural minister, who was a Francophile. He spoke French. He was part of the coup, the colonels, the group of colonels, and another one who was part of that coup was Anwar Sadat. But this guy was he had gotten a doctorate from the Sorbonne, so he was more inclined to help her, and she finally persuaded him, and that was very important, but equally as important is persuading UNESCO to become. UNESCO was essential in terms of the organization of this operation, but throughout the whole time she played mediator between UNESCO and Egypt. I'm astonished that this thing actually came off. There were so many obstacles to it, but without her force of will, it would never have happened. And she was very hard to work with. A lot of people didn't like her, as you can probably imagine, including most of her male colleagues. But boy, she was. I haven't even gone into. She was also responsible in many ways for the whole Tut craze. To thank Egypt, to thank France for what she and France had done, Nasser sent the first major exhibition of Tut's treasures to Paris in 1967. The first time it had, the gold mask and everything else left Egypt, and it was a sensation. She curated the exhibition. It was a huge sensation. Everybody else in the world wanted it. And, we finally got it in the mid-1970s. And people, to this day, I get emails, I remember I saw it in New Orleans or New York or at the National Gallery. It transformed the museum world, the Tut exhibition. It had a huge impact. And she was, in many ways responsible for it.
Lynn, this is the 4th book I've read by you, and this is my favorite by far.
Oh.
Kudos. This is a fabulous book. everyone should read it.
I only paid him a little bit of money.
No, this is a fabulous
Thank you.
book, and your summary doesn't do justice. There's besides the story about Christine, what she tells us is the whole history and the work of French people and others, Jacqueline Kennedy. It's great. And having been there, this brought it alive for me, and I only wish I had read your book before I was there on both my trips. Here's a question, though, and you alluded to this earlier in your remarks. The High Dam, whether it was well-founded or not, it took place. And the Nubian people, the people who live south of Aswan, for maybe 140 miles, were flooded out. Thousands, maybe tens of thousands of people were displaced. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that in the book just a bit, and I'm wondering why there was not more coverage of that, because especially in the book you talk about how Christine was fabulous to her workers
mm-hmm.
and
mm-hmm.
providing medical care, mm-hmm. all that kind of stuff. I was a little surprised there wasn't more about the Nubians who were displaced, and I'm wondering if that was a topic you thought about.
I certainly thought about it. The book is fairly long, and I mean, I go into a lot of stuff, so I really had to keep it short. But to be honest, I wanted to do more. She made a documentary herself. I can't remember what it's called, and I think it's available on YouTube, showing what happened to the Nubians. I think she was caught in a hard place because she was very close friends with a lot of the Nubians, the Nubian workers, but also people that she had met down there. And they did not do justice to those people. Those people were thrown out of, as I said, homes that they had been in, their families had been in for centuries, and they were sent to the desert. They were river people. The Nile was their world, and they lost it all. And to this day, can't go back. And there are a lot of Nubians who are still up in arms about it. I wish I could have done more. If I could have, I would have, because it's really a subject that needs more attention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now that you've had your respite from World War II and from London,
yeah,
the easy part of the question might be, what are you going to do next? And the harder part, perhaps, what other stories of World War II need to be written, and how do you find them?
That's a big question. The answer to the first one, I don't really know. Just your mentioning of the French resistance. When I gave the proposal to Random House, they said initially I had kind of them to, I was going to do a lot on the French resistance and a lot on the temples. And these are top editors of Random House, says, oh, the French resistance is now really old hat. It's stale. The temples, that's really what we're interested in. And I haven't said anything to them, but both the Washington Post and the New York Times review of my book pointed to the French resistance. They singled it out. So I don't think the French resistance is stale at all. I honest to God don't know. I am considering a possible going back to the French resistance and Jacqueline Kennedy at the same time. They do kind of go together. What stories haven't been told? I don't know. If you can find them, let me know, because I'm looking for them. I mean, there are plenty of stories out there. My ideas I usually got from the book I did before. For example, I think it was Question of Honor. That was the third book I wrote and I wrote it with my husband. I found out stuff about John Gilbert Wynant that led me to Citizens of London, but I really don't know what I'm going to do now. I'll let you know. Thanks. Okay. Anybody else? No? No? How much time do we have? We still have time. I'm going to tell you one story.
I'd like to ask
okay.
a quick
Yeah,
question.
please do.
Did you make it down to Abu Simbel, by the way? Have you seen it?
Oh, you gotta go and see
I
it.
know, I have to go. I am going to go see it. I wrote this during COVID. This book,
that?
and for the most part, believe it or not, most of the research I could do online, or I certainly, Christiane wrote a memoir in French that is fantastic, and there was also another book of interviews that were done by several journalists. So that was really good. There's a documentary that Dory and I saw about her. It's also in French. We interviewed the filmmaker, who was incredibly good. We interviewed a former director of the Louvre who knew Christiane, Henri Lorette, who's one of the kind of the legendary, I mean, he's not that old, but he's the legendary directors of the Louvre, and he actually knew her. His mother worked with Christiane at the Louvre, and he said to us that she's the reason he went into museum work, Christiane, because she infected him with that energy and that enthusiasm, and he basically said without her, the Louvre would have been a far stodgier place, that she really brought it alive. But I haven't made it to Egypt yet.
You have to go down there, though, just because it really goes so well with your book, which is going to be just an amazing thing to see,
right.
What they have done. They created the mountain out of artificial mountain just to put the monument there. And to see it, it's awesome.
The story, and I go into
amazing.
Great detail in the book, how they did it.
It's just amazing.
Astonishing.
Yeah.
It really is. I mean, that's worth the price of the book itself,
yes,
I think,
yes.
is the story. I mean, and she really isn't in that part, like for 2 chapters. It's all these engineers and archaeologists that came from all over Scandinavia.
Yes.
I mean, they were from everywhere.
Yes, exactly.
And managed to band together to do this.
I just want to go back to a point that the gentleman said, who had lived actually in Egypt at the time, why the Soviets really got involved in building this dam. Nasser came to the United States and asked them for the help.
Right.
And this is a time of the Cold War.
Right.
Things were really the big powers did not trust one another. There was a lot of problems in the 50s and 60s. And the United States says, no, because you're not our friend. And Nasser was, of course, the leader of the non-aligned nations.
Right.
He was a major player with Nkrumah and Senghor and others, Nehru. They really didn't want to align themselves with either side.
Right.
So he had to go to the Soviets. And the Soviet technology wasn't very good. I think I fully agree with you. That's really where the problem is, and continues to this day. The United States was much more advanced in doing it. And Nasser knew that. He really wanted the U.S. first.
No,
but
I know.
John Foster
I go into detail in the book about that.
Exactly.
It's absolutely true. I mean, because he refused to align himself with the West or with anybody. He was a nationalist.
Right, it was a non-aligned nation.
He cared about his country. Because of that, the Eisenhower administration labeled him as a communist.
That's right.
And so, we can't have anything to do with him. So it really, the whole thing is... It's just so sad.
What we have in our backyard here is the Dulles Airport.
Yeah.
But John Foster Dulles basically labeled Nasser as an enemy because he wouldn't side with the United States. He wasn't siding with the West.
Right. Exactly.
And the argument was, if you're not with us, you're really our enemy, essentially. Yeah. And he alienated a lot of leaders around the world as a result of that policy.
Right.
So that's what with kind of historical context.
Exactly. To her dying day, Christiane de Roche-Noblecourt hated John Foster Dulles. I mean, she did. I mean,
anyway,
she just hated him.
Enjoy talking to you.
Thanks. Okay. I'm going to tell a story really, really fast it's about Jackie Kennedy. She, as I said, she was the one that basically got Dendur. She persuaded her husband to give all this money, and in return, Nasser sent the Temple of Dendur as a thank you gift. But by that time, John Kennedy had been assassinated. Lyndon Johnson was in power. It was supposed to go to the Smithsonian. Jackie and John Kennedy wanted it on the banks of the Nile, banks on the Potomac. To be somewhat like it was, and it was going to go to the Smithsonian. Everybody knew it was going to go to the Smithsonian, except for Thomas Hoving, the head of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who really didn't want the museum, but he didn't want the Dendur, but he didn't want the Smithsonian to have it. He didn't. So he decided he was going to go after it himself, and he was a great showman, and he created. He got these fabulous artist renderings of what the temple would look like under this big glass, exhibit hall. And he had no idea how this was going to happen, but he had them done, and so he went and testified to get the, and he did. He won it away, and it's a great story. He called Jackie Kennedy to try to get her approval, and she came on the phone, and she just exploded at him, and it's in the book. She says, I am never, ever, ever going to do that. I don't want it in your dusty museum. It belongs to Washington. It's Jack's memorial, and you're never going to have it. And it went on and on and on. And so he hung up the phone, decided he was going to get it. He did get it. And eventually, Jackie Kennedy made up with him, and they became friends. But she moved into an apartment building on Fifth Avenue after she left Washington. It's right across the street from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She was in the penthouse. And every night, from her living room window, she would look down and see the Temple of Dendur glowing in that glass exhibit hall. So, all right, on that note, thank you very much.
Thank you.